The first time they tried to erase me from my own company, they didn't even bother hiding the smiles on their faces. The boardroom lights were bright, the long oak table polished like a stage ready for a performance, and every executive in that room already seemed to know the script, except me. My brother Daniel stood at the head of the table holding a folder thick with documents that he called a leadership restructuring plan. When he calmly announced that I was being removed from the company I had built from nothing, a few people around the table actually clapped. I remember the sound of it more clearly than anything else. It was slow, awkward applause, but it was enough to tell me that the decision had already been made long before I entered that room. I didn't argue. I didn't shout. I simply closed my notebook, thanked them for the meeting, and walked out. None of them realized that by humiliating me in that moment, they had just triggered a chain of events that would quietly destroy the empire they believed they controlled. My name is Evelyn Carter, and 5 years before that meeting, the company they had just taken from me had been nothing more than a desperate idea sketched inside a notebook. Back then I was working from a tiny rented office above a mechanic's garage, surrounded by whiteboards filled with supply routes and logistics algorithms that no one else believed could work. Investors rejected me dozens of times. Banks refused loans. Friends told me the idea was too risky. But eventually one small venture firm agreed to take a chance. And with that first investment I built the platform that transformed a struggling startup into a rapidly growing logistics network. Within 3 years we were managing contracts across multiple states. Within 5 years we were negotiating international partnerships. The success story was everywhere in the business press, and every article described me as the visionary founder who turned nothing into millions. What those articles never mentioned was the person who would eventually try to take it all away. Daniel had always been charming. Growing up, people trusted him instantly. Teachers liked him, neighbors admired him, and family members believed every word he said. When he approached me 2 years after the company launched and asked to join the executive team, I thought bringing my own brother into the business would strengthen the company. Loyalty, I believed, would protect us from the cutthroat politics that destroy so many startups. Daniel started in a relatively small role, handling investor relations and financial reporting. At first he seemed helpful. Investors appreciated his calm personality, and board members enjoyed his confident presentations. Slowly he became the face of the company in meetings that I didn't always have time to attend. I believed he was supporting me. In reality he was building something far more dangerous. Alliances. The first sign that something had changed came almost a year before the boardroom meeting. Daniel started questioning my decisions during executive discussions. At first it sounded reasonable. He framed his concerns as suggestions about long-term stability and leadership maturity. Board members nodded thoughtfully. Investors began asking me more detailed questions about my strategy. I didn't realize it at the time, but Daniel had already begun shaping the narrative that I was brilliant but emotionally unstable. A founder who had been perfect for the early chaos of a startup but perhaps not suitable for leading a mature company. The story spread quietly through boardrooms and investor calls, and by the time I noticed the shift in tone, the damage had already been done. When the official vote happened weeks later, they presented it as a necessary transition. Daniel would step in as interim CEO while the board evaluated long-term leadership. My role would be reduced to a non-executive advisory position. In other words, the company I built would continue without me. Employees heard about the decision within hours, and whispers spread through the office hallways. Some people looked sympathetic. Others looked relieved. Corporate culture changes quickly when power changes hands. That night, alone in my apartment, I started reviewing the earliest legal documents from the company's founding. Most executives rarely revisit those contracts after the company becomes successful, but I had always been careful with details. Buried deep in the original investor agreement was a clause so obscure that even our legal team barely remembered it existed. It stated that if the founding CEO formally disputed a leadership restructuring, The company was required to undergo an independent forensic audit before any permanent transition could occur. The clause had been designed years earlier to protect investors from fraudulent founders. Ironically, it now protected the founder from fraudulent executives. The next morning, while Daniel celebrated his promotion and shook hands with investors in the office lobby, a quiet email arrived in the company's legal department. It was a formal request activating the audit clause. For weeks nothing seemed to change. Daniel held company-wide meetings about his vision for the future. He spoke confidently about expansion strategies and leadership transparency. Employees applauded his speeches. Investors praised his professionalism. Meanwhile, an external audit firm began requesting records. Thousands of them. Vendor contracts, expense reports, internal financial transfers, communication logs between executives. Most employees assumed it was routine compliance work. Daniel dismissed it publicly as a bureaucratic technicality triggered by outdated contract language. But forensic audits are patient. They don't rely on dramatic accusations. They rely on patterns hidden inside numbers. As auditors traced financial records month by month, unusual details began appearing. Payments approved by Daniel that bypassed standard authorization channels. Consulting contracts with firms that had no clear operational purpose. Budget transfers that shifted company funds into accounts connected to shell partnerships. None of these discoveries alone proved corruption, but together they formed a pattern that was impossible to ignore. Meanwhile, I stayed completely silent. I didn't contact employees. I didn't speak to journalists. I didn't argue with board members who had supported Daniel's takeover. Silence confused them. They expected outrage, public accusations, perhaps even a lawsuit. Instead, I disappeared from the company entirely while the audit continued quietly behind the scenes. 3 weeks later, the auditors requested a private meeting with the board. The tone inside the company shifted overnight. Investors began asking questions Daniel couldn't easily answer. Board members scheduled emergency calls with legal advisors. Daniel tried to control the situation by blaming accounting irregularities on administrative mistakes, but the audit report was already too detailed. Finally, the board scheduled an emergency meeting. I received an invitation. Walking back into that boardroom felt strangely calm. The same executives sat in the same seats where they had applauded my removal weeks earlier, but their expressions had changed. Confidence had been replaced by anxiety. Daniel still sat at the head of the table, though the authority in his posture had faded. When the auditors began presenting their findings, the room became silent. Slide after slide revealed financial manipulations hidden inside ordinary business transactions. Vendor agreements tied to companies secretly owned by Daniel's associates. Internal approvals that bypassed compliance procedures. Funds redirected into partnerships designed to personally benefit Daniel if the company expanded into certain markets. None of it was dramatic enough to attract immediate suspicion, but together it represented a calculated plan to slowly siphon control away from the original leadership. By the time the presentation ended, no one was looking at me anymore. Every eye in the room was fixed on Daniel. He tried to speak, but the board chairman interrupted him. Daniel was immediately removed from his position pending legal investigation. The irony of the moment wasn't lost on me. Weeks earlier, Daniel had orchestrated a leadership restructuring that removed the founder from her own company. Now the same board was forced to confront the reality that the real threat had been sitting at the head of the table the entire time. After a long silence, the chairman turned toward me. The company, he admitted, needed leadership again. Would I consider returning? I looked around the room at the executives who had once applauded my humiliation. Some avoided eye contact. Others waited nervously for my answer. Power had shifted again, but not through anger or revenge. It had shifted through patience. I agreed to return under one condition. Every executive decision would now operate under strict transparency protocols that prevented hidden financial manipulation. Every contract would require independent oversight. Every investor communication would be documented and archived. The board accepted immediately. Months later, the company stabilized. Employees regained confidence. Investors returned. The logistics network expanded further than it ever had before. The business press eventually published articles describing the situation as a corporate scandal followed by a remarkable leadership recovery. But the truth was much simpler. Daniel believed power came from controlling the room. I knew real power came from controlling the timeline. And the day they applauded my downfall in that boardroom wasn't the end of my story. It was the beginning of theirs.